Great. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm here at UBC Okanagan, and the land on which we're gathering here today in Kelowna is the unceded territory of the Silk Okanagan Nation and their peoples. And I also want to acknowledge that some of you might be joining us from both near and far. And I also want to acknowledge the traditional owners, past and present, of those lands as well. My name is Joan Batorf, and I'm a professor in the School of Nursing at UBC Okanagan. And I'm director of the Institute for Healthy Living and Chronic Disease Prevention here at UBC in Kelowna. We're really delighted to host this session as part of our 8th annual Embrace Aging Month. We began Embrace Aging 8 years ago, co-hosted by the Institute for Healthy Living and Chronic Disease Prevention, Interior Savings and Credit Union, and Interior Health. It's been a great partnership. And we've worked together to try over the years to try to celebrate and raise awareness about positive aging. And as you will have noticed, if you've been on our website, we've organized quite a variety of events this year as well throughout the whole month of March. And as you will have seen, the sessions are really designed for everybody, young and old alike, and focus on a variety of topics and ways to improve quality of life for everyone. Our goal is to inspire each and every one of us to embrace positive aging. So I'm especially delighted to welcome you to today's session. You'll notice on your screen, you may have a closed captioning box. For me, it appears on the bottom of my monitor. You can move that box anywhere you like if it would be more convenient at another place on your screen. Or if you find it a bit distracting, you can turn it off. There's at the bottom of your screen, if you hover there, there's a live transcript button. And if you click on that, there's a way to turn off the closed captioning. Also, we are going to invite comments and questions, and we'll invite you to use the chat box. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, Chiquetta, we might unmute people too if they want to talk. So we encourage you to put in your comments or questions in the chat box at any time during the session. And if we don't get to them during the session, we'll certainly address them at the end. I am delighted to especially welcome our two presenters today. And most of the presentation is going to be done by Sarah Dalman, who is a UBC Dietetics student. And she's going to lead this presentation from her kitchen. It's called Building a Balanced Meal, a virtual cooking demonstration. And her supervisor for her placement at the moment is Julie Sacho, who is manager of nutrition and well-being at UBC Okanagan campus. And so we're delighted to welcome both Sarah and Julie. And I'm going to turn it over to Sarah, who's going to present today from her kitchen. And I noticed some of you are in your kitchens too, so this is wonderful. So Sarah, I'll turn it over to you to start.
Great, thanks so much, Joan. Can everyone hear me okay? Thumbs up, hopefully. Yeah, okay, awesome. So as Joan mentioned, my name is Sarah. I am a 5th-year UBC Dietetics student, and I'm currently doing a placement with Julie, who is a dietitian and the manager of nutrition and well-being at UBCO. So we are very excited to be here. We're going to be putting on a virtual cooking class, and as Joan mentioned, I'm excited to see some of you are in your kitchens. Hopefully you'll be cooking along with me, but if not, you'll get to just listen to my voice and watch me cook along, and then hopefully use this recipe in the future. I know for me personally, one of the things that I've been missing in the past year is the ability to connect with people over food, whether that be connecting by cooking together, connecting by sharing a meal together. So I'm really excited that we have this opportunity virtually to connect and cook this food together, to develop some food literacy skills, and just kind of to have this opportunity to connect. Because I think I mean, in person, we might not have even been able to hold this event. I don't know, logistically, it might have been a bit more difficult. So it's one of the pros of having this Zoom session is we can all be here and chat. And that being said, in regards to connecting, as Joan mentioned, please feel free to kind of participate as you are comfortable with. If you want your camera on, if you want it off, whatever you're comfortable with. If you have questions, feel free to unmute yourselves and ask away, just shout them out and I'll do my best to answer. Or if you'd prefer, just type them into the chat box and then Julie will be, I guess, reading them out and then I'll do my best to answer. Especially if they're questions about cooking or the recipe, I want you guys to be able to cook along with me. So if you have specific questions about the recipe or cooking, I'll try to answer those in real time so you can keep up. But if not, we have a little bit of protected time at the end to answer questions. So logistics, as I mentioned, for questions, either unmute yourself or type them into the chat box. The other thing is we are going to be having some poll questions that we're going to be putting up. And these are meant to just be kind of some fun, interactive ways to get involved and to think a little bit more about nutrition throughout the session. So I'd love if you could just participate in those and then we can talk about them a little bit more. And at the end, I'll have 2 poll questions as well, just to ask you kind of what you thought about the session and what you took away from it. So I'd really appreciate if you could answer those as well. So all that being said, let's get started. So hopefully you had a chance to take a quick peek at the recipe and you have the ingredients and you'll be cooking along with us, but if not, that's okay. So today we're making salmon burgers with green beans and quinoa. And this recipe is for 2 people. So its serving size is 2. If you're cooking for 1 person, you can just cut it in half. If you're making for more than 2 people, you can always double the recipe. If you have any questions at all about how those conversion factors work, feel free to type those in the chat box or ask, and I can help out with that. If something that I typically do as a student who usually is just cooking for 1, really often I'm just cooking for myself. What I'll usually do is for a recipe for 2 people, I will just make the 2 servings and then I'll have the 1 serving as my lunch or my dinner, and then I'll have the 2nd serving as my leftovers. So I encourage you to try that if that's something you haven't tried before. Kind of save some time, save some prep, and I think it works quite well. I know right now is a bit of a weird time. It's kind of in between lunch and dinner. It's a bit of a tea time almost. So if you're not cooking right now, hopefully maybe this is something you'll make for dinner today. Great. And then the nutrition topic that we are talking about today is building a balanced meal. So I don't want to be I'm not going to try to bore you guys with all the nutrition aspects of things. I'm going to try to incorporate it as we chat. And then at the end, we'll get a little bit more into it and pull up a visual and talk about it as we go through. So I'm going to start and I'm going to wash my hands first. So just bear with me for a minute as I wash my hands. I think we all have learned the importance, especially of hand washing in the past year, just to get started here. And then I'm going to preheat my oven to 425. So bake 425. And don't be the person who forgets to preheat your oven and then has to prep all their ingredients and then wait. That's usually me as the person. So just make sure you preheat your oven. We wash your hands and then we're going to get started with the sauce. So I have all my ingredients in front of me for everything. So I have my green beans, I have my canned salmon, I have my egg, I have my mustard, my quinoa, I have olive oil, lemon juice, I have my breadcrumbs, and then I have some fresh herbs. But I'm just going to kind of set everything aside except for what I need for the sauce right now so that hopefully you guys can kind of watch my hands as I cook. So for the sauce, all we need is the olive oil, the lemon juice, the mustard, and then the fresh herbs. So I'm going to get everything else out of the way. And then I am just using a bowl and a fork to prepare it because I like to use dishes that can go straight into the dishwasher so I don't have to wash them. So you don't need anything fancy, just a bowl and a fork is fine. And we're just going to start by adding 2 tablespoons of lemon juice. So either lemon juice in a bottle, or if you have fresh lemons as well, that works as well. It would be probably about just under half of a fresh lemon squeezed. As someone, as I mentioned, who typically cooks for 1 person, I just use this bottle. Mostly I don't use fresh lemons very often because this lasts a little bit longer. I always have it on hand. I don't have to worry about it going bad. for example, in this recipe, we would only use about half the lemon, and then you'd have to find something else to use the lemon for. You don't have to then worry about it going bad if you're just using this juice. So that's something I recommend, is just pick up these ingredients that make your life a little bit easier when you're cooking for 1 to 2 people. And then just a tablespoon of olive oil as well. So I'm just gonna add that. And then we're going to do, I'm just gonna chop up my herbs as well. So in this recipe, you can use fresh or you can use dried. I use fresh, that's what I have on hand right now, but typically I just use dried. If you're using dried herbs, the typical conversion factor, the typical rule of thumb is for whatever in the recipe it calls for fresh, you want to use about 1/3 of that dried. So in this recipe, we're using 1 to 2 tablespoons of parsley and 1 to 2 tablespoons of dill, and that's going to convert to about 1 to 2 teaspoons of each. So 1 to 2 teaspoons of the parsley or 1 to 2 teaspoons of the dill. Again, the dried herbs is a little bit easier when you're cooking for 1 to 2 people, because I don't know if you're familiar, but when you buy the fresh herbs, you're getting this big bundle. And I personally struggle to use it all before it goes bad as someone cooking for just one. So I 90% of the time just use dried unless I'm at the grocery store and I happen to pick them up. And dried by all means is totally okay as a substitute in this recipe. So I'm just gonna start with my parsley. I'm just gonna take about this much. I'm really truly eyeballing this. I just have about this much. And my tip for cutting fresh herbs is kind of rolling. I hope you can kind of see my hand. Rolling it up, almost like a little roll into a little roll, like a cinnamon roll or something, and then holding, and then we're just gonna chop. And the one reminder is when we're using our knives to always use the claw method, holding the food. So holding like this, holding your food like this. And the reason that you want to do that when you're chopping is just you're protecting the tips of your fingers. So I'm just going to chop up my parsley here and try to do, I mean, if you want to do as fine of a chop as you want. And I'm just putting this in my little discard bowl. And I'm just going to do this a little bit finer here. It really, if you want chunkier pieces, that's okay. This is really just for flavor, right? So if you like it really fine and you don't want a big piece of parsley, what be it, or you don't want a big piece of dill when we do that, that's okay. It's really just kind of like what you like. I don't mind having the bigger pieces because I kind of like when I bite into something when it has a bit of a different flavor. Every bite is a little bit different when you have these like bigger pieces. So as I mentioned, I kind of eyeballed this. This is probably a little bit, I don't know if you can see, this is probably a little bit more than 2 tablespoons, but that's okay. I like the smell and the taste of fresh parsley. So I'm just gonna go ahead and add that into my bowl. And then we'll do the dill as well. Something else I want to mention is with this recipe, you really can use whatever seasonings, whatever flavors you want. If you don't like dill, if you don't like parsley, use whatever you like. That's the beauty of making your own sauce from scratch in these recipes, is you can truly season it how you like. So other potential alternatives could be things like cilantro might be good, some basil would be good, maybe some oregano. So just whatever you like, which, like I said, that's the beauty of making your own sauce from home as opposed to buying your sauce in the grocery store. You can really season it how you want. And then the last thing that we need is garlic, and I forgot to grab my garlic, 1 second. So I'm just gonna grab, this is 1 to 2 cloves of garlic. So this one is quite a big clove, so I'm just gonna use the 1. And just to facilitate the peeling process, I just cut it off and then I actually smash it with the end of my knife. And then you can kind of see the peel just naturally falls off there like that. And actually what I'm doing with all my discards, I typically put all kind of my veggie scraps in one bowl, and then you can save that. And if you want, you can actually make a vegetable stock or a soup stock with that. So that's one way to use your veggie scraps, or composting as well is kind of the 2 sustainable ways to use your veggie scraps. So that's why I just have my bowl on this side here. And then I'm just gonna chop up my garlic. So I actually really really hate chopping garlic. And typically what I do is I just buy the pre-chopped garlic that comes in a little jar from the grocery store because I love the taste of garlic and I hate chopping it. I hate when my hands smell like garlic. I really find it really tedious. So I usually just buy pre-chopped garlic from the grocery store. And I think cost-wise, it's probably a little bit more expensive, but I think of it in regards to a time-saving thing. And it makes cooking a little bit more accessible for me. Like I said, I like to use garlic in probably every recipe. I usually use more garlic than is called for. And I love to use it. And if I had to chop up an individual clove of garlic every single time, I probably wouldn't use it as much. So sometimes I do things like that where I just save myself time. I just buy the pre-chopped garlic because that's what works for me. So don't ever feel like you can't just make your life a little bit easier by making those little switches or those little hacks. Okay, so that's our 4 ingredients. So we have the lemon juice, the olive oil, the fresh herbs, and then the garlic. And then I'm just gonna take my fork and I'm just gonna whisk it. So as I mentioned with regards to making your own sauce at home, it's great because you can truly season it how you like. The other reason I really like making my own sauces and making my own marinades is because, again, when cooking for 1 to 2 people, and I don't know if you guys have the shared experience, but I've definitely experienced this, is I'll buy a jar of sauce from the grocery store and maybe I'll use a quarter, maybe I'll use half in my recipe, and then I don't use the rest. I put it in my fridge. I don't want it anymore. I've had enough of it, or I forget about it, or what be it, and then it goes to waste. When you make your own sauce at home, you can make the exact amount that you need for your recipe. Nothing goes to waste. So you'll find this recipe that we're using exactly, we're gonna use all the sauce. None of it is gonna go to waste. So it's a little bit more, it helps you cut back on your food waste. You get to season it how you want it. The third reason I really like making my own sauces from home is that we know that one of the biggest sources or the highest sources of salt and sodium in our diet is from processed and takeout and restaurant foods. So that includes the processed sauces that you're buying from the grocery store. And the reason that that's important is the general recommendation for overall health, for overall prevention of chronic disease, is to limit your sodium intake to less than 2,300 milligrams. And what does that mean? So that converts to about a teaspoon of salt. So the general recommendation for overall health for reducing risk of chronic disease is to have less than a teaspoon of salt a day. That's kind of what we're trying to aim for, which might sound kind of overwhelming, might sound kind of difficult to do, but if you're cooking your meals at home and you're making your sauces at home and you're limiting those takeout foods and limiting those processed foods, it's a lot easier because you can fully control how much salt is going into your meals, as opposed to when you're buying those takeout foods, when you're buying those restaurant foods, you can't really control. And a lot of times they add way more salt than you need for flavor. So what you might find with this sauce recipe specifically is we're getting flavor from the lemon juice. We're getting flavor from the dill. We're getting flavor from the parsley and from the garlic. So I actually typically won't add salt to this. If you want to add salt, if you want to add salt and pepper to taste, by all means go ahead, because there's no salt added to this. And in comparison to a sauce you would buy from the grocery store, it's way lower in sodium. So if you want to add salt and pepper to taste, go ahead. But you might find, if you're making this right now, or if you make this sauce in the future, you might find like it's so aromatic, it smells so yummy. I don't really need any salt or pepper to add to this. So I'm just gonna try to show you guys kind of, I don't know if I can show you what it looks like, but it's quite liquidy, which is perfect. If you want it a little bit, you need to add a little bit more liquid, just add another dash of lemon juice, another dash of olive oil. But otherwise, I think we're all set, we're good to go. So my sauce is ready to go. I'm just gonna set this to the side. And we're gonna move on to making the salmon patties. So Jaquetta, if you could put up the first poll question before we get started. This is gonna be our first poll question of the day. So I'll just give us a minute to put that up. And like I said, it's okay if you don't know the answer. It's just supposed to be meant to be a fun thing. So the question is, when building a balanced meal, what proportion of your plate should be protein foods? So if you can envision a proportion of your plate, what proportion? Is it a quarter? Is it a third? Is it a half? Is it all of your plate? What do you guys think? And I'll give you just a minute to answer that. And while you do that, I'm just gonna get my ingredients that I need for my salmon patties. So I'm just gonna grab my breadcrumbs, my canned salmon, my egg. I'm gonna get this cutting board out of the way. And I'm gonna grab an extra bowl here. Okay, so I don't know if everyone got a chance to answer that question. Okay, so I see that most of you said a quarter, and then the rest of you said a third. So the correct answer to that question is actually a quarter. So great job, guys. I'm quite impressed. Yes, clap for yourselves. So yeah, if you can envision a plate when building a balanced meal, the proportion of your plate that you want to be protein foods is about a quarter of your plate. So in this recipe, our example of protein food is the salmon. Other examples of protein foods are any type of animal foods. So things like meat, chicken, other fish other than salmon, low-fat dairy products, so milk or cheese, eggs are also protein foods. And then the other piece of protein foods, the other side of that is plant-based proteins. So soy or tofu, beans, legumes, nuts, seeds, all those good plant-based proteins. So a protein food doesn't have to be an animal food. It can come from plants as well. And you want to aim for, in your meals, aim for a quarter of your plate being protein foods. So great job. Let's make our salmon patties. So, I'm just gonna make sure you can kind of see what I'm doing here. So we're just gonna start, and we're just gonna whisk the egg to start with. So in this recipe, and again, I just have a bowl and a fork because I'm a simple cooker in that I like to be able to put things in the dishwasher, and a bowl and a fork works perfectly. So just using a separate bowl from my sauce bowl, I'm just gonna put this egg in. And in this recipe, the egg acts as a binder. So it acts to bind all the components of the patty or the salmon burger. It acts to bind it all together. So I'm just whisking here. I'm just whisking my egg all together. And actually in this recipe, the egg is the only raw part of the burger. So when we're thinking about cooking these patties, all we have to make sure is that the egg is cooked through. That's the only raw part. Because the canned salmon is actually fully cooked. If you wanted to eat the canned salmon straight from the can, you could. It's fully cooked in the canning process. We just have to make sure that we're cooking the egg all the way through. Now I'm just gonna go ahead and open my can of salmon. So if you are not a canned fish fan, or you've never had canned salmon before and you're skeptical to try it, I really hope that I can convert you to being a canned fish fan, and especially canned salmon fan. I'm gonna talk a little bit more about why I think it's such a good pantry staple to have, and why it's such a nutritious food, and why it's so versatile. So hopefully by the end of this, I'll convince you to incorporate this into your diet more often. One thing that I was gonna mention, I know depending on where you go to the grocery store or what brand that you're buying, there's different sizes of the cans. It's not standardized, and I don't know why, but that complicates it a little bit. But this can that I have is 213 grams. I'll just bring it a bit closer so you can kind of see. So it's a little bit bigger than like a typical size of a canned tuna. And that's about, it's about 6 ounces of fish. If you weren't able to find 213 grams, if you found something smaller, which is 170 grams, or if you could only find the 100 grams, that's okay. If you found the 100 grams, hopefully you got 2. If you just have the 170 grams, that's okay as well. I would just recommend when we go to add the breadcrumbs, maybe just add a little bit less than the half a cup that the recipe calls for. But you can kind of see, I'll show you guys kind of how mine forms together, and you can kind of use your judgment on how much extra breadcrumbs you need to add, or if you need to add more just to kind of help it thicken up a little bit. So you're going to want to drain the juice out of the salmon. We don't need the extra moisture, so I'm just over at my sink draining it. And then we're just gonna go ahead and add this straight. And I'm just gonna show, for anyone who's not cooking at home right now, I'm gonna show you what the inside looks like. So canned salmon is actually canned whole. So the whole salmon goes into the can, which means the bones and the skin are included. Don't be grossed out, don't worry. You actually really can't taste the extra bones or the skin, especially for putting in a recipe like this, where there's quite a few different textures from the breadcrumbs especially. You're probably not going to notice a difference in taste or texture, but what you are going to get from having this canned salmon, because in the canning process, the bones really soften, so you're actually able to eat the bones from the canned salmon. And because of that, you get way more calcium and way more vitamin D. So canned salmon specifically, even more so than fresh or frozen salmon, is an amazing source of calcium and vitamin D. And we'll talk a little bit more about why that's so important in a little bit, but we're just gonna add this into the bowl with the egg. Just get that all in there. And then I'm just gonna set my can to the side so it's out of the way. And then we're adding a tablespoon of mustard. It doesn't, I think on the recipe it says Dijon, but it doesn't have to be Dijon. It can be any type of mustard. The role of the mustard in this recipe is to kind of emulsify all the ingredients together. So to kind of bind and keep them all together. So don't fret if you don't like the taste of mustard. You're not really going to be able to taste it. It's more so just to kind of help bind in the same way that the egg is acting as a binder. So I'm going to grab my tablespoon, and we're just adding a tablespoon of mustard, again, just to help bind. Ooh. This virtual cooking class is really testing my abilities to multitask. Okay, great. So a tablespoon of mustard. And then the last thing is just half a cup of breadcrumbs. So I have panko breadcrumbs. A fun little trick in regards to breadcrumbs is if a recipe that you have calls for breadcrumbs and you don't have breadcrumbs in your pantry, there's two things you can do about that. Either one, if you have crackers, you can take crackers and crush them up, and those can act as breadcrumbs. Or if you have bread, you can toast it on a really high setting and then crush that up, and those can act as breadcrumbs as well. So kind of some little tricks if you don't have the recipe ingredients. Typically, I never buy breadcrumbs. I always forget to, and then I always need them. So I'm usually finding these little tips and tricks and hacks and ways to hack recipes so I don't have to run to the grocery store just to make my dinner. So as I mentioned, about half a cup. If you use a little bit of a smaller can, maybe use a little bit less. And then we're just gonna add that to the bowl, and then we're just gonna mix and mash it all together. And again, just a fork is fine to do this. And we wanna mix it quite well because we wanna give all the different ingredients and all the different components of this a chance to kind of mix together and emulsify. We want the breadcrumbs to soak up some of the liquid. We want the egg and the mustard to kind of help and mix and bind everything. So we're just gonna mix this quite well until it kind of starts to form together. And while we mix, I just wanted to come back to my plug for the canned salmon again. And I wanted to talk specifically about vitamin D. So as I mentioned, with canned salmon, because the bones are softened, you can eat the bones. They're a really good source of calcium and vitamin D. So you may or may not have heard a lot of talk about vitamin D in the past year. It's quite a hot topic. And part of the reason why is because vitamin D is an important vitamin for our immune health. So there's been quite a lot of talk about immune health in the past year. Vitamin D is also really important for your bone health, and it can help with your mood. So it's a super important vitamin. As Canadians, and typically in Canada, there's two things to know about vitamin D, and that you can get it from food. You can get it from sources of vitamin D, such as the salmon. You also get it from the sun. So as Canadians who just in general probably don't get enough sun, You guys probably in Kelowna get a little bit more sun than I do living in Vancouver. It's not the sunniest place. We really want to be super careful to try to incorporate these foods that are high in vitamin D to make sure that we're getting our vitamin D needs. So this canned salmon, as I mentioned, a great source of vitamin D. Other good sources are egg yolks. So the yellow part of the egg, having the whole egg is a good source of vitamin D. So we have an egg in here, that's great. And then another really good source is cow's milk that's fortified with vitamin D, or soy milk as well. If you don't drink cow's milk, all soy milk should be fortified with vitamin D as well. So those are all some good sources of vitamin D. So I just have this all mixed together here, and I'll kind of show you guys. I just have to come closer to show you. So you can kind of see as I mix it, it's starting to kind of stick together, starting to kind of solidify. So you wouldn't really want it any wetter than this, any more moist than this, because then you might struggle to make a patty, but this is actually perfect. So if yours is a little bit, if it's not quite this sticky or forming this well, you might just want to add a little bit more breadcrumbs, maybe just like a spoonful more breadcrumbs, and then mix it together more. And then we're actually just going to set this to the side, and even just letting it sit on itself, the breadcrumbs are going to absorb a little bit more moisture, so it's really going to form into a good patty. So I'm just going to set this to the side. And then we're going to get started on our green beans. So Jaquetta, before we get started on our green beans, could you put up our second poll question, please? So I'll just get that put up. And while we do, I'm going to get all my, oh, you know what? I forgot. Sorry. Again, the multitasking. Okay, we'll do the question first. So the poll question is, when building a balanced meal, what proportion of your plate should be fruits and or vegetables? So if a quarter is protein, what proportion of our plate do we want to have as fruits and or vegetables? Is it a quarter? Is it a half? Is it 3/4? Is it all of the plate? So I'll give you guys a chance to answer that. And if you're cooking along at home with me, I forgot to add the sauce to our veggie or to our salmon patties because I was multitasking and I got so excited about talking about canned salmon. So we're just adding a little bit of the sauce that we made before. We're just going to add a little bit of that just for flavor and then mix that in. Okay, so I see your answers and I see that most of you said half. So that is awesome. That is the correct answer. That typically when building a balanced meal, we want half of our plate to be fruits and vegetables. So in that half, doesn't matter what fruits or vegetables you're having. Truly, it can be whatever you like, whatever you're interested in, whatever tastes good to you, is what you can incorporate as your fruits and vegetables. There's no restriction within that. And something specifically that I wanted to mention in that regard is it doesn't have to be fresh fruits and vegetables. So frozen or canned fruits and vegetables are just as nutritious as fresh fruits and vegetables. And again, when cooking for 1 to 2 people, if you're buying produce, sometimes the way it's packaged for whatever it is, you might not be able to eat it all right away. So having the canned or the frozen to lean back on to kind of prevent that food waste is a great alternative. And again, it's truly just as nutritious. There's no need to avoid those canned or those frozen fruits and vegetables. My only caveat to that is when you're purchasing these, you just want to watch and make sure that you're looking and trying to choose ones that don't have any added salt or sugar. So sometimes it's mostly more with the canned fruits and vegetables that they'll add the salt or the sugar to them. So trying to see if you can find ones that don't have any salt or sugar added in the canning process. But otherwise, by all means, the canned or the frozen fruits and vegetables are totally okay. And I'll give you guys, as we go along, I'll actually give you a tip on how you can incorporate frozen vegetables in recipes that call for fresh, and how to kind of like, if you're roasting your frozen vegetables, how to keep them from getting too soggy and trying to get them crispy. So we'll talk about that in a minute. I'm just going to clear this up a little bit more. Hopefully you guys can kind of see my hands as I'm going. So I have my baking sheet And then our vegetables today are green beans. So for the sake of time, I actually trimmed my green beans already, or I trimmed most of them already, but I wanted to just show you guys, if you're not cooking along with us, and if you're not super familiar with green beans, this is what a green bean, when you buy it from the grocery store fresh, looks like. So it has these little kind of ends on the end. These are edible, you can eat them, but the texture of them, if you've ever had them, it's a little bit stringy and fibrous. It's not the best part of the green bean, in my opinion. So typically you want to cut these off, or you want to chop these off, and that's what the description of trimmed green beans. That's what this looks like, where the skinny ends are cut off. So either you can chop them, or the other thing you can do is you can actually just break them off. So if you just kind of take the end, it will naturally just break in a good position. So I just wanted to show you guys how easy that is. As I mentioned, I trimmed most of mine already for the sake of time, but look at how easy it is to just break the ends off. Like, it's really a lot simpler than, in my opinion, than having to chop them and focus on kind of like really focusing on your knife skills and being careful there, when you can just kind of break them off just like this. So I'm just gonna do, I just left myself a couple to do here, just to show you guys how easy it is to break them off instead of actually having to chop them. And then otherwise, I have all my green beans are trimmed. So we're gonna put them on the baking sheet, which we wanna line with parchment paper. So I'm just gonna grab parchment paper out of my pantry here. So I'm just gonna line my baking sheet with parchment paper, and we're just gonna put them directly on the baking sheet, and then we're gonna drizzle the sauce. So put these directly on, and then we're gonna drizzle the sauce. You don't have to use green beans also in this recipe. If you don't like green beans, there's, like I said, any fruit or vegetable can fit within that half of your plate recommendation. So there's no need to force yourself to eat a vegetable that you don't like. I think other veggies that could go really well in this recipe could be things like broccoli, maybe some asparagus, some roasted carrots could be really good. I think those are all good alternatives to green beans if you don't like them. And I'm just kind of trying to get them all kind of coated in the sauce here. And then I'm just gonna get them, just make some space on your pan. If you're doing this, just make some space on your pan for the salmon patties, because we're gonna put the salmon patties on here. So try to get them all kind of like evenly spread out on the pan, and then we'll add the salmon patties to this. Great. So I'm just gonna set this. So you can see I kind of just made some space in the middle, but wherever you can find space on your pan. And I love a pan meal because it means less dishes. So you don't have to wash. It's not like we have a bunch of different pans going where we're pan frying our salmon burgers and then we're pan frying our green beans. Nope, we can just put this all in a pan, put it in the oven, easy cleanup. So we're gonna form our salmon patties now. And again, sorry, I forgot to add the sauce to it. So if you didn't have a chance to add the sauce yet, just make sure you do that. That's just to add some extra flavor. And with this recipe, you can make it into 2 big salmon patties, or you can do 4 smaller ones, whatever works for you. I'm gonna do 4 smaller ones. And the way that I kind of try to like portion it out is I'm just kind of like with my knife, just making like a little X in my bowl. I don't know if you guys can see, I just kind of like made a little X in my bowl, just to kind of do my best to make them even sizes so they're cook a little bit easier, but it's okay if they're not even sizes. And then we're just gonna form these patties with our hand actually, because our hands are all washed and ready to go. So I'm just gonna form, I like mine a little bit thinner, but it's up to you kind of how you like them. And you'll see as you form it, it comes together and sticks together really well. So that means the egg and the mustard is working, it's doing its job. So this is kind of what mine looks like. It's about the size of my palm, quite thin as you can see. And then I'm just gonna place that on my pan. So we'll just do the rest of them now. And again, if they're not all the same size, no worries. It's not, I mean, none of us here are professional chefs. We're just doing our best. So just do the best you can to get them the same size so that they cook evenly, but there's no pressure. So I mentioned already, I like a baking a pan sheet recipe because it limits dishes. I also think it helps to limit the time that you're spending, as opposed to having to kind of stand over a stove, especially at the end of the day. You're tired, you're fatigued, you don't want to be on your feet all day. Just pop them on the baking sheet. You pop it in the oven. You don't have to worry about it. You can kind of go do some other things. You can do the rest of your dishes. You can go sit down if you want to. You don't have to worry too much about it, which that's why I like kind of like a baking sheet recipe. And the last reason I really like a baking sheet recipe, actually, that's not true. The second last reason, when you're making fish, I find, I don't know if you guys can relate to this, but sometimes if you're cooking fish, the entire kitchen then smells like fish. And sometimes it will smell like fish for days. And you walk into your kitchen and you're like, oh, I wish I hadn't cooked that fish. So I don't want you guys to feel that way when it comes to cooking fish. So one of the ways to kind of help minimize the fishy smell is actually cooking it in the stove, or cooking it in the oven instead of cooking it on the stove. And just part of the reason for that is because you have it kind of enclosed in an enclosed area, as opposed to having it on a frying pan on the stove. All the aromas are going all over the kitchen. If you keep it in the oven, it kind of encloses some of the smell. So if you're one of those people who doesn't like the fishy smell, that's a good option. I'm just gonna wash my hands really quick because there was the raw egg in that. Just give me a minute here. Okay, hands are washed. So I'll just give you a quick peek at my pan now. So I have my 4 relatively evenly sized salmon patties with the green beans kind of around. And we are going to just pop these straight in the oven. So hopefully your oven is preheated. So let me just take a quick peek at mine. Okay, so those are going to go in the oven for 15 to 20 minutes. I'm going to set my timer. We want to flip them half the way through. So I'm just going to set a quick timer for myself for about 10 minutes so that I can check in on them halfway through. And then I just wanted to mention too, the last thing I was going to say about baking in the oven as opposed to pan frying. Another reason why I like to do that sometimes is because typically you're just going to use a little bit less oil. So as you guys saw, we used about a tablespoon of olive oil for everything. So all the oil we used was just in the sauce. It was a tablespoon of olive oil, and that was for the patties, and it was also for the veggies as well. So just because of the nature of the cooking method, baking in the oven typically just uses a little bit less oil than if you're pan frying. So sometimes I like to try to incorporate baking recipes a little bit more often, but by all means, if you prefer to pan fry, this recipe has, you could make this recipe in a pan as well. And you'd probably cook it about like 8 or so minutes on each side, and then just flip it. And then the green beans, same thing. You probably want to pan fry them for about 10 to 15 minutes type of thing. So that's all good to go. How are we doing for time? Okay. We might not get everything cooked by the time this is done, but I think we're still doing okay for time. We're going to move on to making the quinoa. And before we do that, I have one final poll question for you guys. So you may have noticed a theme in the poll questions. So Jaquetta, if you could put up that last poll question, that would be awesome. So the question is, when building a balanced meal, what proportion of your plate should be made up of grains? So is that a quarter? Is that a third? Is that a half? Is it none? Do we not need any grains on our plate? I'll give you guys a chance to answer that. And then I'll just get what I need for the quinoa here. So for the quinoa, it truly just is quinoa, a pot, and water. Okay. And I see that 90% of you said a quarter. So that's awesome. That is the correct answer, is a quarter of your plate should be made up of grains, and specifically whole grains. So we can talk a little bit more about that. You may have kind of used your math skills and thought, okay, so if we're using half of our plate as fruits and vegetables and a quarter as protein, that leaves a quarter for the grains, and that is correct if you're thinking of it as a whole plate. And in this recipe, the whole grains that we're using are quinoa. Other examples of whole grains could be things like brown rice, whole grain bread, whole wheat pasta, oatmeal, bulgur, barley. So there's a variety of different grains that you can use and incorporate into that kind of whole grain food group. So we're using quinoa today. I don't know if you guys have ever had a chance to try quinoa, if you've used it before. I really like it because it cooks very similar. It's essentially cooked the same way that rice cooks. And it has a similar texture, but it's a different texture and a different flavor. So in most recipes, you could use it interchangeably with rice, and it just is a good way to add a little bit more variety. So this recipe calls for rinsing the quinoa first. And the reason that sometimes recipes will call for rinsing quinoa is because there's kind of an outer coating on quinoa called saponin, which is safe to eat. There's nothing wrong with eating it. But some people say that it gives it a little bit more of a bitter taste. So I actually personally don't find quinoa that bitter. I don't mind the taste. So if you've never had quinoa before, what I'm going to recommend is try it without rinsing it, because that eliminates the step of what you have to do. It makes it a little bit easier if you don't have to rinse it. Try it, see what you think of it. And if you like it, then that just cuts the step out for you. If you've had quinoa before and you find it bitter, you don't really like it, maybe try rinsing it and see if that helps a little bit. So it's perfectly fine to eat quinoa not rinsed. So what we're going to do is we're going to, quinoa cooks the exact same way as rice in that it's 1 part grain to 2 parts rice. So I'm just measuring out half a cup of quinoa. Again, if you want to rinse it, go ahead and rinse it. You just want kind of like a fine mince, like a fine strainer. And then I'm just going to add that to my pot. And then I'm just going to bring this over to my sink so I can add a cup of water. Okay. So I just added a cup of water to this, and then we're just going to put it on the stove uncovered. And this amount of quinoa will probably take about 10 minutes or so to cook. So we put it uncovered on medium to high heat. We want to bring it to a simmer, and we essentially want it to cook until all the water is absorbed in the same way as rice. So you can cook it on the stove. If you have a rice cooker, it works in a rice cooker as well. And then we're just going to keep an eye on it so that we can kind of take a peek and see how it's going. You might need to turn it down a little bit as the water starts to evaporate. But truly, it's just the quinoa in the water, and I'm going to put it on the stove for on a medium to high heat. And you might just need to check on it too to give it a little extra stir too. But it's really an easy one. So I'm just going to put this to the side. Great. Okay, so we have our patties and our veggies in the oven. We have our quinoa on the stove. So everything's good to go. And how are we doing for time? Great. So we have a little bit of time now to chat a little bit more about what building a balanced plate means and why we want to do that, and talk a little bit more about the plate method. But before we get started with that, I just wanted to check and see if there's anybody has any questions about the recipe or anything. Is everyone kind of following along okay here?
Yeah, I think so. Marlene was asking if this recipe is gluten-free, so.
That's a good question. I can answer that. So quinoa, yes, is gluten-free. The breadcrumbs would not be gluten-free. It would depend on what type of breadcrumbs you're using. But if you have a gluten-free cracker, you can find gluten-free breadcrumbs. Or if you can find gluten-free breadcrumbs to use. So that would be the only alternative you'd want to make there. And I think that should be everything that would have gluten in it. Was there any other questions that I can answer right now? I'm just going to take a quick peek. Oh, temperature is 425. Yeah, great. Okay. So then I'm gonna ask Jaquetta, if you don't mind, could you just screen share the website for the New Canada's Food Guide? So I just wanted to bring up a visual for you guys to look at so that you have something to look at in regards to what the plate method looks like. So this is what we've been talking about all day. This is the building a balanced meal. This is the plate method. And you can see here, half of it is split up into fruits and vegetables, a quarter is protein foods, and then a quarter is whole grains. So that's exactly what we've been talking about today. And this is actually Canada's new food guide. I think it came out in either 2019 or 2020, I can't remember, but it came out very recently. And this was the new food guide kind of to replace the updated version of the old food guide that you're probably all familiar with, that was from 2007, that had the rainbows and all the food groups and the different food servings that you should aim for every day. So this is the new food guide. So if you haven't had a chance to take a look at this, I really encourage you to go to this website and play around with it and see kind of what they have to offer. And the biggest takeaway from the New Canada's Food Guide is building a balanced meal and using this plate method. So you might be wondering, why did we go from all these different serving sizes and specifics of food groups and everything to kind of just this one plate that seems very general and seems like very unrestricted in what you can eat? And the reason for that is we really want to focus on a guideline that is really easy to follow and really easy to incorporate into your meals. So this method where it's proportional, you're aiming for about half of fruits and vegetables, a quarter of protein, and a quarter of grains. That's hopefully you'll find that that's pretty easy to apply to as many meals as you can, or to all your meals moving forward, or it's something to think about moving forward. And I do want to say just quickly, not all your meals are going to look like this, and that's okay for a variety of reasons. Not all my meals look like this. It's just something to kind of aim for. This proportion, this split up is something you want to aim for, but not all your meals are going to look like this. And one of the reasons why is we don't eat all our meals on a plate that can be perfectly proportioned out in a certain way. So if you're having something like a pasta sauce or a stew or something, more so what you would want to think about is what proportions of the foods are you having in there? Do you have about half of what you're having is fruits and vegetables? You have about a quarter as grains, about a quarter of protein foods. And that's kind of the biggest takeaway that you want to think about moving forward with this meal. Is just, again, it's just a guideline. Not all your meals are going to look like this, but just something to think about. And my timer is going off for the salmon patties. So I'm just going to pull these out of the oven so that we can flip them. So I can put them over here and hopefully you can kind of see. So things are starting to cook here. I mean, mine look a little, typically you want them a little bit more brown than that. So I'm gonna flip it right now. But you can see they are starting to brown a little bit and it's getting quite formed. So I might actually just put mine in the oven for a little bit longer than the remaining kind of 8-10 minutes that I had set on my timer. And you can see that the veggies are starting to soften. They're starting to cook as well. So I'm just gonna pop this back in here. I mean, everyone's oven is different, so it always just depends. Just pop this in. And while I'm paying attention, I'm also just gonna give my quinoa a stir as well. So I'll show you guys kind of what it looks like. So mine has started, I don't know if you can see, I don't want to dump hot water on my laptop. Mine has started to bubble and started to simmer, and the water's starting to get absorbed. So I'm just going to keep it on that temperature for now. If your water has started to kind of absorb a little bit more, you might want to turn it down a little bit, but I think just a couple more minutes on that guy and we're doing okay for time. Yeah, the last thing I really just wanted to say about the balanced meal and the balanced plate method is the reason that we aim for that is because each component of the different food groups, quote unquote, so the fruits and veggies, the protein, the whole grains, they all provide us different nutritional value whether it be through vitamins and minerals, through the fiber they're providing, through the protein that you're getting from. And they also provide us different tastes and textures within each of them. So if you're aiming to have your meals looking like this, where it's half fruits and vegetables, a quarter protein, a quarter whole grains, that's a really good way to make sure that your meal is not only providing you really great nutritional value, you're going to feel full and you're going to feel satiated and you're going to feel satisfied after eating it. And you're going to have lots of different tastes and textures in your meal as well. So hopefully it keeps things interesting. Because again, within each of those food groups, the biggest thing to aim for is just variety within the food groups, right? So I kind of still have some things cooking. I was just going to take a quick peek to see if there's any other questions. I see that Bev asked, is there a preferred type of salmon to use? I have pink salmon. So I think I use pink salmon as well. And I picked that one probably because it was the least expensive. And I am on a student budget. So there's no preferred type of salmon to use. Whatever fits into your budget, whatever you like, is great and works for you. Unfortunately, I don't want to take things out of the oven prematurely, and hopefully your stuff is baking as well. I was going to maybe try to show you guys how this can come into a balanced plate, but hopefully you can visualize it from the Canvas Food Guide visual. Does anybody else have any final questions that they wanted to cover before we finish up here?
I didn't see any others in the chat, Sarah.
Great. And then I see that Julie just linked some extra nutrition information that you can check out. The Unlock Food website has some great nutritional information. And then also the Canada's Food Guide website that we displayed up above also has some great information on it. So if you click on each of the different food groups, it'll take you to more information about each of the different food groups and why they're important to incorporate that unfortunately we didn't have time to get into today. But I think hopefully you learned a new recipe. Hopefully you've been converted to canned fish if you weren't already. Yeah, and Julie just linked the food guide down there below. So I am just going to give my quinoa a stir. I think my salmon burgers just need a couple more minutes. Yeah, I think that's kind of it. Oh, I see another question here. Snack groups. So Stella asked, what snack groups should one focus on? That's a really good question. So when we're making a snack, I like to think of trying to include 2 different food groups in my snack. So if, for example, you're having a banana as a snack, with a banana, I would pair some peanut butter because then you're getting some fruits and veg from the banana, and then the peanut butter is going to get some protein from it. So trying to incorporate kind of 2 of the food groups into each snack that you're having as much as possible is the recommendation that I would make. So always trying to kind of pair, because then again, it's going to help make sure you're feeling full and you're feeling satisfied after having that snack.
Wonderful presentation, Sarah.
Oh, thank you. Hopefully you guys learned a little bit. I had so much fun doing it.
Do you want to carry on with your last 2 polls?
Yeah, so we just have 2 last poll questions that I was hoping you could fill out, just to let me know what you guys thought of the presentation. And maybe everything will finish up while we're finishing those. So I'll just give you guys a chance to answer those poll questions. Great. So I'm glad to see that you guys are hopefully liking the recipe. And then there's just one final poll group or poll for you guys. And it's, how likely are you to utilize the plate method when making meals in the future? And Deborah, just in response to your question about what has the info about the different food groups, Julie just responded, and it's the Food Guide Canada is the website. Awesome. Oh, good. I'm glad to see some of you are hoping to use the plate method moving forward. And if you have any more questions about it, I think those resources that we linked below are good starts. Yeah. So I think we'll probably, yes,
oh,
go ahead.
Oh, no, carry on. Yeah,
I was
we're
just
at
gonna
3
say, I think-
o'clock.
Yes, I was going to say, I think we'll probably wrap up here then.
I have to say, I'm very, very impressed with your recipe today and all the awesome information you gave us throughout the entire demonstration. Multitasking was done so well. I'd like to thank you and Julie and all of our attendees for joining us. And I hope you enjoyed yourself as much as I enjoyed myself watching this demonstration. And please join us for the rest of the Okanagan Embrace Aging events that we have coming up. Ending on March 31st. We have a few more left to go. So join us for more great ways to embrace aging. Thank you again for joining us. And thanks again for a great recipe, Sarah. Take care.
No worries. Thank you all. Have a good rest of your day.